Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The finalists for the next chief of the Grand Rapids Police Department are set and have the chance to address the public in a forum earlier this week. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster, here from the Wood TV live desk. Joining me is the man responsible for making that final decision, Grand Rapids City Manager Mark Washington. Mr. Washington, thanks for joining me. How are you this morning?
I'm good, Luke. Thank you for having me.
You bet, you bet. So we have three finalists for the position. We'll go over their names just real quick, ladies and gentlemen. There is a link attached to the stream that'll take you over to woodtv.com with a little more on each of these three candidates here. Jim Blocker, he's the chief of police there in Battle Creek. Jutiki Jackson, he's retired Milwaukee police inspector. Eric Winstrom is a Chicago police commander. Now, there was that forum on Wednesday night. The public had the opportunity to address those candidates in front of the commissioners, the Kent County prosecutor, yourself, so on and so forth. We'll dive into that in just a moment. But today, January 21st, where do we stand on the hunt for new police chief here in Grand Rapids?
Well, first of all, I want to thank, again, you for having me here and thank the public for their participation in the process. And it's not just been their participation this past week, but when we started this last fall, after Chief Payne announced his plans for retirement, we engaged the public in stakeholder meetings, virtual forums, I think over 26 virtual forums. We hired a consulting firm, public sector search and consulting firm. Gary Peterson, CEO, has done a great job of making the public and potential candidates aware of the opportunity to come and work for a great department and a great community here in Grand Rapids. And as a result of that process, we had the interest of over 30 people, and people have asked me, was I pleased with the applicant pool? And I go back to the process that we had last time. We had as many or more candidates that applied for the position this time. I looked here recently at the city of Chicago when they did their last search for their chief law enforcement officer superintendent, and I believe they only had 25 people apply. And so I think what it indicates is that law enforcement is a challenging profession, and since the incidents of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, not only are we finding it hard to attract people at the entry level of law enforcement to make it a career as officers, but also at the executive level. So having said that, I am very pleased with the work that was done. We had a pool with diverse candidates, and as you mentioned, the top three was brought forth this past week. They were in town for 2 days, this past Wednesday and Thursday, and spent literally from sunup to sundown in meetings, and one which was the community forum that you referenced on Thursday night. On Wednesday night, I'm sorry. So we really had a good opportunity to hear perspective from the public. This is one of the things I really am pleased about in Grand Rapids, is that even though I have the prerogative of making decision and just making an appointment and announcement, I mean, that really, the charter gives me the authority to make the appointment, and all I have to do is announce it. I wanted to go beyond just announcing a chief and including the community in this process, really participatory, engaging, and helping me think through not only the qualities of the chief, but their feedback on the top three finalists. And so we were able to hear from them. They provided comment in person, online, through social media, and we're in the process right now of digesting it. It's a lot to take in. There were over 80,000 social media views and 24,000 direct communications about this process. And so now we're still trying to figure out all the commentary and comments and categorize them, but it's really very, very helpful to include the public.
In those meetings, you said, forum aside, that each of these candidates were in meetings all day and every moment that they were here in town. Who else were they meeting with?
Well, some of the meetings included meetings with departmental staff in the police department, both senior level staff, as well as going to officer roll call, looking at the department, touring parts of the city. Other meetings included meetings with law enforcement partners from the county, the state, the prosecutor, prosecutor, judges, people who are part of law enforcement's criminal justice systems. There were other meetings with people who are part of our community, neighborhood organizations, business organizations, other people who participate on some of our boards that offer oversight and accountability, from our Citizens Appeal Board to our Safe Task Force. There were literally meetings all throughout the day, every day, including meetings with other key staff like the fire department chief, as well as other department directors. Our oversight office, for example, also had an opportunity to meet the candidates as well.
So let's hop into Wednesday night's forum. In your opinion, how did it go?
I thought it was good. I thought it was very helpful. It was over 2.5 hours of conversations and questions that the community had about the candidate. It was very direct. I mean, this is a very scrutinized position, and there were a lot of tough questions that were asked of the candidate, and it gave us a realistic job preview for us to see how people respond under pressure, because most of the time when you see the police chief on TV, unfortunately, it's because there's been some kind of critical incident, and oftentimes the chief has to be able to communicate with community in the midst of crisis, and yet do it in a way that assures calm as well as confidence. And so that gave us a chance to see how the candidates were able to respond.
So you've had a full day to digest how it went. Have you had an opportunity to speak with commissioners to kind of go over each candidate's responses there from that forum? Yeah,
well, it's an ongoing process. Some have offered feedback, both elected, non-elected, and I'll be taking all that in consideration over the coming weeks in the process. And so they literally, many of them just left town this morning because there were meetings until late yesterday evening as well. So it's still an ongoing process.
Let's talk about takeaways from that forum individually. Let's start with Chief Blocker. What is one thing you took away that you learned about him?
Well, I learned a lot about all of them, and I think Chief Blocker definitely has the most familiarity with some of the local issues. We're in the same region in terms of the state, oftentimes in a lot of same meetings when it comes to support of law enforcement combined efforts, and so he had a lot of familiarity with our community, and I sense that he's well respected in his community and has done a good job as chief there, and he has proven that he can be a leader.
And then kind of moving down the list here, we have them from left to right there. Mr. Jackson.
Yeah, same in terms of, different in terms of coming from out of state, rather. Part of a large metropolitan area, him and Commander Winstons, one coming from Milwaukee, then Chicago, and the commonality of those, they're both Midwesterners. They've both had long, extensive career in law enforcement, and have some unique insights coming from larger communities on how they police. And what Mr. Jackson indicated in his presentation is that he was very community oriented in engaging community, particularly those in the faith-based community, and as part of his policing efforts. And so that came through, as well as a lot of discussion around his background and qualifications, and particularly, I mean, just to be very direct about it, the incident that happened earlier in his career in law enforcement with the use of force.
And we'll dive into that in just a moment as well, but then moving on to Mr. Winstons as well, Commander Winstons.
Yeah, I think he was very familiar with a lot of the things that we were doing as a city and things we were discussing around cutting-edge initiatives like Cure Violence. And he understood some of the conversations we were having around technology, and I think he referenced a couple of issues that we discussed going through our community using surveillance previously. And so even though he and Mr. Jackson, again, not from Grand Rapids or the area, they're coming from large Midwestern communities that have faced a lot of the issues that we're facing, and I think what they offer is an opportunity for us to learn from both the things that have been done well in their communities, but also, just face it, some of the urban challenges that they've had in those areas and maybe have not managed as well, but we get the benefit of their knowledge and lessons learned in moving forward.
So I want to move on now to a question about each of them individually as well. Chief Blocker had voiced his familiarity with the city of Grand Rapids. You mentioned it there as well. He appears to be the candidate who knows the most about West Michigan and specifically Grand Rapids here. How important is that knowledge of the city to you for our next chief?
Well, I got to speak in. It's always important to know the community, but there is an opportunity to know or get to know the community. I'm not a Grand Rapidian by birth myself, and have relocated to the area. But I think as long as a person has a desire to love the place where they are, and to make this home, that they will, the community will support those that care about them. And so I think, again, coming from West Michigan, Battle Creek would obviously help with familiarity, but I think regardless of where the person is from, what the community wants is a chief that is engaging, that is a good communicator, that cares about both community as well as the well-being of his officers. And so I think Chief Blocker certainly will help. His knowledge of knowing West Michigan will help, but it's not just good enough to know West Michigan. All three of them have to know Grand Rapids. And it takes time, no matter where you're from, to really learn the unique needs of each community, of each neighborhood, of each organization. And so I don't, even our past chief, Chief Payne, he was very familiar with Grand Rapids specifically, having grown up within the organization, within the community. But when you're chief, there's another level of knowing community, and that's beyond just being familiar with the geographical nature of it. It's knowing how do you bring a community together when on issues they can be so divided, and knowing which people to bring at the table, knowing which conversations to have and how to have them. That's also part of knowing community.
On Wednesday, Mr. Jackson, the moment he stepped to the lectern during that forum, addressed the 1997 shooting deemed accidental, despite some conflicting reports from those who were in the area, testimonials. When questioned by News 8 earlier this week, the city of Grand Rapids responded by saying, quote, "It was aware of the shooting, but also noted that Jackson went on to have a long and distinguished career with Milwaukee police." Do you believe that incident should define Mr. Jackson's opportunity or chances of becoming our next chief?
Well, let me just say that in life in general, I don't think any one incident should define a person, regardless of who they are, within or outside of law enforcement in general. I think your life is more than just one incident. Having said that, there are critical incidents that are defining for every person, every moment. And we were well aware of that critical incident that occurred in Mr. Jackson's career. But this is a job application process, and we have to evaluate people on merit. And the merit of the case was that there was due process, both internal to the department as well as in the criminal justice system, and there was not a conviction or discipline that was meted to Mr. Jackson in that effort. He was cleared of that wrongdoing, and so based on the merit as an employer and looking at the qualifications, he was as qualified as the other top candidates that we brought to the table, and that's how the decision was made. And given the recency of the incident, we're talking about something that's over 25 years ago, and his career has shown, as well as his trust with his community, that he has moved moved forward very regrettably. I mean, you heard that from him, that any loss of life is very unfortunate, and particularly when you're dealing in policing. I think what we learned from this discussion with Mr. Jackson, there are critical decisions that officers have to make that in every moment oftentimes can result in life or death decisions, and that's why these jobs are so stressful, and they're so important to make sure the right people are in place. And so I truly understand both Mr. Jackson's perspective, but also the sensitivity that community members would feel in having a candidate of this type in the process. And I think Mr. Jackson spoke for himself. I don't want to speak for him. He spoke for himself in explaining what has happened and how he felt about it, and then more importantly, how he would move forward in policing our community if he were selected as chief.
Mr. Winstrom, on top of law enforcement, is an attorney. Do you believe that helps or hinders his capabilities to serve strictly and solely as our police chief here in Grand Rapids?
I think the acumen that we would have with Mr. Winstrom and his law enforcement background certainly is an asset. Because policing is about people, but it's also about the law. And knowing how to appropriately apply the law is important, but more importantly, he's not an attorney. He's a career officer, and so he's been in the uniform his entire career. He's progressed through the ranks, and he's happened to bring the best of both worlds together in terms of his career, both his law enforcement background as well as his legal background, and that has proven to be an asset for him in the department. And I think those kind of skills would be certainly transferable here in Grand Rapids.
Let's talk next steps now. Again, we have had that forum. We're slowly moving into spring sooner than later. January is almost a thing of the past. What is our next step here?
Well, again, there's still opportunity for the public to participate by offering feedback until Wednesday. And you can go on our website and looked at the form this morning. Basically, it asks questions about each candidate, your thoughts about each candidate, and you can submit those online, or you can call in 311 as well and offer your comments telephonically. But that's the process, and after that I'll be evaluating all the feedback and making a decision of who our next chief will be, and then we go in the process of negotiating and discussing start dates and transition, and then we'll make a public announcement.
Last time we spoke, you gave me a deadline. Has that changed?
No, I'm hoping that an announcement will be made, certainly by the middle of February, if not before. Chief Payne he's anxious to go and enjoy his retirement. We'll be talking more about his last days in the near future as well. But I think we're in a good place to have the handoff, and I think we have really good candidates. I look at, again, just the nature of law enforcement, and I just want to be clear. Given how law enforcement has been criticized, there's not the interest that existed prior to the pandemic that exists now. It is a tough profession, and as we interviewed those candidates that came to our city, they were also interviewing us to determine whether or not this is the kind of community that they want to work for. And not only were those candidates reviewing us and interviewing us, but even other prospective candidates who would have thought about applying in the last process or may think about applying in the future, is now saying, is this the kind of city that I would like to be chief of, both internal and external. And I think to some degree you may have even seen the response internally, because people have asked why weren't there more internal candidates, specifically the deputy chiefs that are in the department in their application for police chief. And I think, all of those factors weigh into their consideration as well. I don't want to speak for them, but what I would offer the community, as we're interviewing candidates, both the current and prospective candidates are also interviewing this community on how we have and will treat our police chief.
City Manager Mark Washington. Mr. Washington, anything else that you would like to add?
No, I just again want to thank the public for their process, their participation in the process. We really value public input. We've done it with this hiring the police chief, with our participatory budgeting process. That's really where public input is essential. We're doing it with our community master plan because it's not our community solely in terms of staff or elected officials. It's the city of Grand Rapids, and for major decisions around our city, we want to do it with our community, and this is certainly one of them.
Mr. Washington, thank you for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a link attached to this stream. It'll take you over to woodtv.com, where you'll be able to find all the latest from the search for a new chief for the Grand Rapids Police Department. This has been a look at the Wood TV Live Desk. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Laster. Have a great afternoon, folks.